we looked at opera in the Baroque period, we saw that the stories were very often about historical figures like Julius Caesar, or they were based on mythology. So we would see stories of like Dido and Aeneas. Once we get to the classical period, our audiences are more interested in seeing stories about people they might actually encounter in real life. So we see a lot more stories that involve at least real kinds of people. They're not gods and goddesses anymore, but they're probably not the people that you would have run into on the street, because some of the major characters we see in these operas are kings and princes and counts and people of rank. So obviously all the audience members didn't know people like that, but they knew of people like that. Remember, we're in a period of time now where there's a lot of revolutionary things kind of going on, and so making fun of those people was pretty common. There's a lot of literature that does that. We have a lot of operas where the people that had up until this point been the people, these are the rulers, these are the elite. Well, now we're going to make fun of them a little bit. And we're going to see that in the opera that I'm going to ask you to watch by Mozart. So Mozart wrote a lot of operas. Many of them are comic, many of them are serious, and some of them sort of defy description. So let's have a quick review of what operas can be. So we can have comic operas, which in Italian would be opera buffa. Opera comique is not quite comic opera, even though it sounds like it should be in French. It's a little bit of a hybrid. We have serious opera, or opera seria. And then later we'll even see some bigger, more dramatic kinds of operas that we'll call grand opera. But basically, at this period of time, operas have certain characteristics that you can expect to see. One of those is that we're going to have those three different types of vocal genres that we talked about earlier. Remember, aria, recitative, and chorus. So those are the three basic components of the vocal part of an opera. At the beginning of the opera, you will usually have an overture, and you're actually going to get to watch an entire opera, so you'll have all of these bits. The overture is where the orchestra plays. Sometimes the music has something to do with what the story's about. Many times it does not. But it gets the audience settled into their seats, and that's a good function for the overture at this period of time. When it was going to be a big, long production, people were there for quite a while, and they would bring all their food, and the cheap seats were bring your own lunch, and so you had to kind of get the audience ready for the show. So we're going to take a look at Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, which is very popular. You can see it performed lots of different places. It's performed all over the world every year. So in The Marriage of Figaro, we have the Count and the Countess Almaviva, who are the elite people in our story. And they're very different because the Count is basically a philanderer, but his wife is very true to him, and she knows that he runs around with other women, but she loves him anyway. But it's painful for her, and as you will see when she's finally introduced later in the opera, it's difficult for her to know that her husband fools around. So he becomes our sort of comic character because that's not a good behavior. That's just not the behavior that we expect our upper class people to uphold. So the characters get to pick on him about that, and that sort of becomes the core of the story. So we have the Count and the Countess, and they each have servants. So the Count's servant is Figaro, who's the main character of the story. And he's getting ready to be married to Susanna, who is the Countess's maid servant. I'm not sure what her proper title would be, but she works for the Countess. So the two of them are supposed to be getting married, and hence the title, obviously. So the whole story revolves around their relationship, the relationship between the Count and the Countess, and the fact that the Count also wants Susanna. There's a reference in the story where they talk about, and those who speak French, you can just cringe now when I speak French, the droit du seigneur, which means the rights of the master, basically. And what happened in that period of time was that the master of servants was allowed to deflower his female servants before they got married. That was just one of his rights. So there's a whole scene in here about how he's going to give up that right to Susanna. So that's kind of a big moment. And if you don't understand the history of that particular tradition, it doesn't make any sense. And you think, well, what's the big deal there? But there's a whole lot of comic intrigues where the Countess is trying to get the Count to behave better. Figaro wants him to leave Susanna alone. There's another character who wants to marry Figaro. And they all sort of get delightfully tangled up, and in the end, of course, everything is solved, and there's the moral of the story at the end, which is, be true to your school kind of thing. Be faithful to the one that you're supposed to be faithful to. But as you listen to it, as you watch the opera, what I'd like you to focus on is to be able to distinguish those differences between aria, recitative, and chorus. The chorus part's easy. You got a lot of people on the stage, and they're all singing pretty much the same thing. That's a chorus. So we're not going to spend any time making you listen to one with me, because you can figure that out. That's not hard. But what we are going to do is look at the aria and recitative part, so you can get an idea what those are, so that as you listen you can have a better perception. So what's the difference? Recitative is basically dialogue. So we have subtitles on this, so you'll be able to see. If there's a lot of text going and it doesn't repeat itself very much, then that's probably recitative. The accompaniment is going to be much more sparse. So we might have just a harpsichord, a basso continuo kind of thing going, maybe a few other instruments, but it's not going to be something distracting. The whole point of recitative is to tell us a story so that we know what's going on. So we set our story up with the recitative. Once we all know what's going on, then we go to aria. Aria is usually for a soloist, although there are some duo arias in this particular production. There's even one section where we have 6 people singing at once. But basically in the aria, the character gets to tell us their feelings about what's going on or what's about to happen. So it tends to have more repetition of the text. So if you see a lot of repetition of the same text, or as often is done in subtitles, they just don't tell you what they're saying anymore because you've heard it before. If the subtitles go away completely, okay, they're just repeating something that they just said. So that's very typical. The structure of the aria is sort of held over from the Baroque period, where we had the da capo aria. In the Baroque period, when they came back to that second time around on the aria, they would embellish it and do lots more fancy things. You see less of that in the classical period, at least now in modern productions. During that period of time, it's quite possible that the singers would have done more embellishing, because after all, you paid money to go to that particular performance because you wanted to see your favorite singer and you wanted to hear them as much as possible. So the structure would be you'd have a section in one particular style, a contrasting section, so it's a B, and then we usually go back to the A section. So we're going to look at just the very beginning of this opera, and at this point, Figaro and Susanna are preparing for their wedding, and he's trying to figure out, this is the space they're going to be living in, he's trying to figure out how to make the furniture fit. So he's measuring and all of that. So let's listen to see what's going on here at the beginning. All right, so there you've seen a little duo aria. Not big and fancy, they didn't get highly emotional. They're still sort of setting up the story for us, so it's not like what we think of like aria grand. It's a sort of a light aria there. But you can see that the instruments have interesting parts to accompany them, and that the melody is really very pretty. Now let's contrast this to the recitative that immediately follows. Okay, you can see that that's very different in style. It really is like 2 people talking to each other, except that they're using pitches instead of what we think of as normal talking. The only accompaniment we have is the harpsichord and the bass cello part. So we know that this is not what people paid to hear, the singing part. This is the part that's telling us the story. So recitative is going to sound like that almost throughout this particular opera. Very sparsely accompanied. You'll get the sense that they're talking to each other. The melodic lines for the recitative are not particularly exciting. It really does sort of follow speech patterns. So if you think that if you were just going to talk to your friends but you're going to sing it, that's sort of how it comes out. And then we'll be interspersed with arias. Obviously the arias are the fun part. So as you watch the rest of this opera, a couple of things to look for. One of the main characters is a soldier, a young man named Carabino. And Carabino is supposed to be like 15 or 16, so his voice really hasn't changed yet. And this role is always performed by a woman. We're in a period of time now where women would have actually been on the stage. So in this kind of role is usually called a trousers role or a pants role. It was intended that way. The composer wrote it to be sung by a woman so that you get that higher sort of vocal quality that a young man would have before his voice changes. But it also lets us do some really interesting comic things. So in this particular story, Carabino, who, I mean, he's a hormonal teenager, basically, and he's in love with every woman he runs into, including the Countess. So there's dressing him up like a girl. So we've got a woman singing the part of a man, dressing up like a girl. So it can be very confusing. But it's just one of the conventions of comic opera that we often have this kind of role where a woman gets to play a man's part and pretend to be a girl. It's just one of the things that they do. So I hope you'll enjoy The Marriage of Figaro. It's an entertaining opera. It's a little long. Most of the operas from this period of time do tend to run longer than a modern opera. Remember, people didn't have any place else to go. They were perfectly happy to stay at the theater all evening. So watch the entire opera, get a good sense of how recitative and aria and chorus work. Pay attention to how the instruments are used. That will help you to distinguish it from when we start looking at romantic opera later. You'll be able to hear a difference in the types of instruments that are used and the ways that they accompany the singers. So enjoy The Marriage of Figaro.